Now, with those preliminaries, I want to suggest that the story of the tabernacle begins not really with Moses and the children of Israel at Mount Sinai, which is where we first encounter the term tabernacle in the Bible, but it begins all the way back at the beginning in the book of Genesis, and particularly in Genesis chapters 2 and 3, where God had created man and woman and put them there in the Garden of Eden. I want to suggest to you, I'm not going to try to defend it in any length tonight, but I want to suggest to you that the first tabernacle in the Bible was actually the Garden of Eden. If you think of a tabernacle as being where God dwells with man, if you think of the tabernacle as a place that is uncorrupted by sin, where God and man can dwell together in fellowship with one another, then the first real tabernacle in the Bible was the Garden of Eden. And there are a number of things later in the Bible that I think will suggest that in fairly clear terms. I think, for example, when they did build the tabernacle and put the cherubim there. Well, you remember where we first meet cherubim guarding and keeping people out? The Garden of Eden. Remember, they had the lampstand in the tabernacle they built at Sinai, shaped like a tree, I think probably intended to remind us of the tree of life. But when we get in the book of Revelation to the end of the Bible, heaven itself is described both as the tabernacle of God and as paradise. The only other place referred to as paradise in the Bible, of course, is the Garden of Eden. Now, I would suggest that the first tabernacle, the first place that God and man dwelt together in fellowship, is actually in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. But the crux of the matter really begins in Genesis chapter 3. I often make the observation to my students that if it weren't for Genesis chapter 3, the Bible would have ended at Genesis chapter 2, which sounds like one of those profoundly stupid statements, I suppose, in some ways. Obviously, if you cut it off at chapter 3, that's all you've got. But my point is, if what happened in Genesis chapter 3 had never happened, the rest of the Bible would never have been written. If man had never sinned, if he had remained in fellowship with God, I suppose there are a lot of questions I don't know the answer to. Would God have, how many children would they have had, and would they have kept expanding the size of the Garden of Eden, and maybe a whole lot of things like that I don't know about. But this much I know. If man had never sinned, if what occurred in Genesis chapter 3 had never occurred, the rest of the Bible would never have been written. Because all of the rest of the Bible is telling the story about how man, who because of his sin is separated from God, is thrown out of the Garden of Eden where he had dwelt in fellowship with God. The rest of the story of the Bible is about how God can make arrangements for man to come back into fellowship with him and dwell with him once again. So in Genesis chapter 3, when the serpent that we meet deceives the woman, and the woman in turn seduces her husband as well to join in her sin, and God commands them to leave the garden. Understand that when he commands them to leave the garden, there's more going on there than just punishment. It is, of course, punishment. Sometimes we punish our kids, and what do? We take away some nice thing they have for a period of time. But God wasn't just taking away a nice home. God was removing them from the place where they had been in his presence. When they were there in the Garden of Eden, it appears that they were able just to walk and talk with God. I don't know exactly how you do that, but it certainly seems that that was the closeness of the relationship that they had. And when they were removed and those cherubim were placed there so that they could not come back, they were being removed from the fellowship and presence of God that they had enjoyed. They were separated from God. And that's what sin does. It separates man from God. And as I say, from that point on, all the rest of the story of the Bible is how man who has been separated from God by his sin can be reunited with God and brought back into fellowship with God and ultimately brought to dwell with God once again. Well, the next several chapters of Genesis are not very encouraging. After Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, things pretty much go downhill. In fact, the world becomes so corrupt that God destroys the world and mankind with a flood. and lets them start over. He has, in effect, kind of wipes the slate clean and gives them a whole fresh new start. He even says the same words all over again. Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. But after the flood, the very next thing we read about is Noah's sin and his son Ham's sin. And shortly after that, the Tower of Babel. And it is apparent that man is not going to solve this problem. That if man is ever going to get back into fellowship with God, it's not going to be a result of something man figures out how to do. If man is ever going to get back into fellowship with God, it's going to have to be God's doing. It's going to be by God's grace. It's going to be God's gift that is going to bring about a restoration of fellowship so that man can come back and dwell with his God again. That brings us to Genesis chapter 12, because in Genesis chapter 12, that's where the downhill run is reversed, where God intervenes, where man, having, I guess, demonstrated as thoroughly as possible his incapacity to find his way back to God, man finally is met by God with the promise that God makes to Abraham. Genesis chapter 12, God makes a promise to Abraham that includes a number of elements, but the key to the whole thing is God promises a blessing. Not just a blessing to Abraham, but he makes a promise that through the seed of Abraham, a blessing is going to be brought to all mankind. And in the context of those early chapters of Genesis, that blessing can only refer to, you might say, the antidote or the counterpart to the curse that we read about back there in Genesis chapter 3. Man lives under the curse of sin. He is separated from God and subject to death. What does he need? What sort of blessing does he need? He doesn't just need a little more food here or a little better health there. What he needs is life and a restoration of fellowship with God, to be able to dwell again. That's the blessing that man needs. And in the context of these chapters of Genesis, when God makes this promise to Abraham that he is going to bless him, and he is going to bless those who bless him, and through him all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed, I believe the promise that God is making in the larger context even of the Bible is ultimately the promise of a restoration of fellowship between God and man, so that man can come and dwell in the presence of his Maker, his Creator, once again. And so from this point, the next several chapters of the Bible follow these descendants of Abraham. We follow them as patriarchs through the land of Canaan. Eventually we follow them down into Egypt, where they become slaves, bondmen down there. They end up spending 400 years in Egypt, apparently the greater part of which they spent as slaves there. Finally, as they cried out to the Lord heard their cry. The Lord remembered his promise to Abraham. Not that he'd forgotten it, but he remembers it in the sense that we remember a birthday. We call it to mind. And God raises up and sends Moses to deliver them out of their bondage in Egypt. And of course, Moses leads them out of Egypt, ultimately going to lead them to Canaan. But first, he takes them down to Mount Sinai, where God is going to appear to these people and give them their law. And I want you to turn over to the book of Exodus now. Turn over to the book of Exodus. And of course, if you look in Exodus chapter 20, you'll remember that it is here that God speaks from heaven and speaks in the hearing of the children of Israel the Ten Commandments. And then if you come over to perhaps a less well-known passage, but an equally important passage, Exodus chapter 24, after God has revealed his law to the children of Israel, or at least a portion of his law, Moses reads that law in the hearing of the people. And they say, all that God has said we will do and be obedient. In fact, Moses reads a second time. And they say a second time, all that God has said we will do and be obedient. And then they enter into a covenant with God. And they offer the sacrifice, an ox that's the sacrifice of the covenant. They sprinkle some of the blood on the people and some of the blood on the altar. And they enter into a covenant with God that we commonly call the Old Covenant. And after that, the next several chapters proceed to tell, in fact, almost all of the rest of the book of Exodus, with a brief interruption of the incident of the golden calf, is the story about God telling them to build a tabernacle for him.